I am Tamara Ishalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads.
What we did not intend is for your generation to turn your backs on our people. We wanted you to be Zionists. We did not intend that our emphasis on tikkun olam, social repair, would lead some Jews to join anti-Israel demonstrations.
It's not every day that a rabbi's Yom Kippur sermon goes viral. After all, it's not a cute puppy video or a heartwarming baby clip. It was a tough, painful speech about something deeply personal and urgent, how some Gen Z Jews are distancing themselves from Israel. And yet it resonated across generations, racking up millions of views. In that sermon, Rabbi Ammi Hirsch expressed his frustration that while educators, parents, and rabbis have instilled the value of tikkun olam, repairing the world, they never intended for young Jews to abandon the equally vital principle of Kol Yisrael arevim ze leze. All of Israel are responsible for one another, and join anti-Israel protests on campuses. I'm thrilled to have him with us today. Shalom, Rabbi Hirsch.
Shalom, Tamar. It's good to be with you. I'm excited about your new podcast. Aptly named Crossroads, because that is exactly where we are in Jewish history, I think.
A brief introduction for our audience. Rabbi Ammi Hirsch is a leading voice in the American Jewish community, known for his dynamic leadership and deep-rooted dedication to Israel and Jewish values. He is the senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City. For more than 3 decades, Rabbi Hirsch has been at the forefront of Reform Judaism with a particular focus on advancing the Zionist cause within the movement, a mission that has shaped much of his life's work. And before all that, he served as a tank commander in the IDF. Rabbi Hirsch, let's dive into the powerful sermon you gave. Walk us through that striking observation.
Well, I've been concerned even before October 7th about what I observed was the intensifying distancing between American Jews generally and Israel, and specifically in the non-Orthodox community. But when October 7th hit, then to me it became an existential question, because we discovered a phenomenon that was especially hurtful and damaging in my view, which is not simply, a general predisposition to advocate the Palestinian cause, but in the light of October 7th, to minimize the horrendous harm on Israel and the Jewish people, and to join our enemies. It's not simply political opponents. These are people who want to destroy the Jewish state. Seemed to me to reach a critical state within American Jewry that demanded of those in Jewish leadership to respond as vigorously as they possibly could, because this was outside the pale. And if it were to continue, it would cause enormous damage, of course, to Israel-diaspora relationships, and some damage to Israel. But frankly, it would destroy the cohesion of the American Jewish community, which is my primary concern, because I'm optimistic about Israel. I believe that Israel will survive one way or the other, with or without American Jews. But we, the American Jewish community, can't survive without a deep connection and what we call in Jewish theology the brit, a covenant between ourselves and world Jewry, the heart of which is the state of Israel. And so I felt that this became a kind of existential question for us in America too, and it required of people in public positions in the American Jewish community to lay out a claim and to counter the claims that were driving those who were opposed to Israel. So that explains the increased vigor that I've applied, both rhetorically but also programmatically. We've invested by now millions of dollars. We've recruited and invested millions of dollars in this effort to sustain American Jewry's commitment to Israel, Zionism, and Jewish peoplehood. And we're doing our best to ensure that that continues into future generations.
When you reflect on decades of liberal Jewish education, I assume you find yourself asking, so where did we go wrong? I mean, what could we have done differently? Why is this happening?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that self-reflection is an indispensable part of improvement and self-realization and self-understanding. I should say that on that specific issue, when I turned to the young people and I said, we wanted you to be liberals, part of the crisis in American society is that liberalism has been dragged into the hard left, and as it's dragged to the hard left, it's dragged many of our own Jews, and in many respects, I don't consider the views expressed by the hard left to be liberal. That's as a liberal, that disturbs me, and so I've given a lot of sermons and speeches about that as well, and have written about that. But I turned to the younger generations. I expressed to them, of course, we raised you to be liberals. That is our understanding of Judaism. V'nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. Those were the first words that God communicated with Abraham in establishing the Jewish people. And it continues as a central theme throughout Jewish texts and Jewish history. So, of course, we wanted our younger generations to care about the world at large, to do what they can to repair the world, to express liberal humanitarian values. We did not intend that they would turn against our people, turn against Israel, and join our enemies in the middle of a war.
As part of their activism that they see as tikkun olam.
Which they then told us they are doing in deference to what we ostensibly taught them, which should give us, all of us, pause, because that we didn't intend. We mistaught. Tikkun olam does not mean abandon the Jewish people, abandon Israelis, and join those forces whose whole purpose is to destroy the Jewish state. And some of that is infused with just downright classic anti-Semitism as well. Not all of it. A lot of the criticism against Israel, even if it's not correct, is legitimate. It's appropriate. And it's important for the American Jewish community to understand the distinction between what is legitimate criticism, even if it's wrong, even if it's unfair, even if it's motivated by nefarious motivations, but is still within the realm of legitimate and does not seep into anti-Semitism. That's really important for us. We don't always make that distinction as well as we should, given our history. Maybe that's understandable, but still. So I think it's important for us to lay down philosophical, ideological, communal markers, what we consider to be legitimate criticism of Israel, even if we disagree, and what spills into anti-Semitism. So that said, I didn't really expect that those who believe that among the younger generations would actually care that much about what I think or say. Because, number one, I don't know if it's characteristic of Gen Z or if it's characteristic of every generation. I was young once, too. I was in my 20s once, too. And, I thought older people kind of were just shouting in the wind anyway, and so didn't really expect them to respond in a strong way, and nor did I really address my remarks to them specifically, even though I did turn to them, because there's a part of me that thinks that for many of them, it's beyond my capacity or the capacity of most of us to reach them.
Do you believe that there can be a meaningful dialogue with Gen Zs who, go on demonstrations against the existence of Israel? Yes. There could be dialogue that could bring change.
So for those who are willing to take me up on the offer, and there have been quite a few, people I didn't even know, people who contacted me and said, I live in this and this part of the country, but I'll be in town for the weekend. Can I come and see you? Because you said you would be willing to speak to us. I said, yeah, absolutely. And I had a number of those conversations. The implication of that is that if they're willing to sit with me for 45 minutes or an hour, that at least they realize, if they're not open to it, that I might respond, right? And so that might give me an opportunity to impact on them. That said, from the perspective of our communal resources and my personal capacity to reach those who you describe are committed anti-Zionists. I'm not optimistic that I, for sure, can reach them to the degree, at this point in time, can reach them to the degree that it will make a difference on them. And I'm skeptical that others can do that in an effective way as well. Now, one, I could be wrong, because I'm not, I concede that there are many people in the Jewish community who have skills that I don't have, and if they think it's worth the effort to continue that dialogue, I certainly support that. And I am also aware that, as I said before, I believed a lot of things when I was in my 20s that I no longer believe. So I expect that some of them, once they progress in their lives and they have vocations and professions and they have mortgages and they have kids, they might come back to us. But for now, I don't believe that there's much I can do to change the mind of somebody who has those commitments. My focus really, when I spoke to the immediate 2,000 congregants who were there, and I expect that I speak to many thousands of other people who watch me by now, that it's not too late. While it may be too late for the time being for those people, it's not too late for their parents, and it's not too late for the younger generation coming up. And that was my real focus. It was to say, hey, you younger people, you preteens and teens, okay? This is not what we intended. And there has to be a voice in your life. These people are bombarded nonstop with messages that are not what I'm delivering. Mm-hmm. So there's got to be a voice that says to them with clarity, don't have to agree. It's their right to disagree. But that a voice that says to them with clarity, this is what we believe, this is what we want from you, this is what the vast preponderance of the American Jewish community believes, and Israeli society, i.e. world Jewry, and here are the values that we want to convey to you and we want you to be committed to.
Which maybe in the past was a bit vague, that message. But what needs to change now beyond that message to ensure that today's kindergartners or elementary school kids grow up with a different perspective?
So in looking back on this, first of all, the challenges are hard for us because the small minority of American Jewish kids are in day school. More of them are in summer camps, and that's very effective in terms of building a Jewish identity. But even that is limited to, 4, 5, or 6 summers. And so the preponderance of American Jews who do receive some kind of Jewish education do so in synagogues. And we have severe challenges because they spend only a short amount of time here on a weekly basis. And it's hard to do. I mean, if you were to think back on your own education, and if you wanted to know math, you needed to work at it, right? Or English, or philosophy, or history, or anything. Let alone identity building. Right? Identity building is a very complicated thing. That is not only intellectual learning; it's also emotional stimulation. And if you're not exposed to that emotional stimulation, it's hard to develop the kind of identity that Jews have developed throughout our history. So number one, it's difficult. But number two, looking back, if to the extent that these graduates of our institutions are telling us that they are pursuing these values as an extension of what we taught them, and their conclusion is, we are abandoning the very values that we taught them because we have a blind spot when it comes to Israel or the Jews, we have to look back and ask ourselves, what did we teach? Despite our good intentions, how did it come to be that our young people gleaned from our teaching them about the Jewish concern for the world, for non-Jews, our obligation to help repair the world? How is it that they gleaned from that Israel and the Jews are the source of evil in the world? Racist, genocidal, and so on and so forth.
But this tension that you described seems to be inherent in liberal religious education, doesn't it? I mean, balancing Jewish particularism with progressive universal values often creates this ongoing friction. And Would you say that the beauty of a liberal Jewish identity lies in its ability to navigate and embrace that tension, but at the same time, building such an identity in a child is far more complex compared to a strictly secular or orthodox upbringing, where these contradictions don't present themselves in quite the same way?
It's all true. I agree with what you said. It's complicated. It's difficult. It's part of what we should be self-reflective about, because that is not what we understand, and it is not the authentic interpretation of the concept of tikkun olam. And so if they, which means for your English listeners, repair of the world, the Jewish obligation to repair society. So if they gleaned from that a understanding that of Jewish universal values that abandons Jewish particularism, our commitments to each other as Jews, then we mistaught. And that's the first thing we have to look at carefully, and we have to instill from the earliest possible age, again, in the sense of not only intellectual theories, but deep-seated emotional resonance, to Ahavat Yisrael. Judaism is a blend. This goes to your second question. Judaism is a blend between Ahavat Abriot, love for all creation, and Ahavat Yisrael, love for the Jewish people. Tikkun Olam doesn't mean, is not Jewish universalism that is not anchored in Jewish particularism, in Jewish responsibility to fellow Jews, is not Jewish universalism. It's just universalism. So that we haven't taught well enough. I think we need to pay more attention to it. As you say, there are many challenges because of liberal education. But I also want to emphasize what we're seeing on the hard left in American society and in the West in general. I do not, in many respects, is not liberal.
It isn't.
It's a betrayal of liberalism. And when I emphasize the betrayal of liberalism, I speak as a liberal who is still committed to liberal values, right? And so to the extent that Americans are confused by that and American liberal Jews are confused by that, it's incumbent upon us to emphasize and delineate. We've always felt, and this is one of the reasons why we resonated so much with the civil rights movement, that Martin Luther King expressed the most eloquent principle of 20th century liberalism when he said in his famous I Have a Dream speech, I want my 4 little children to grow up in a country that judges them not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The reason Jews resonated to that is consistent with the deepest Jewish aspirations for humanity at large. And that's liberalism. Anything that departs from that, especially if it's tinged with anti-Semitism, can't be liberal. You know, I have a basic standard that I use. If something is anti-Semitic, if there's a theory that's anti-Semitic, it can't be liberal. If a theory is anti-Zionist, it can't be liberal, because Zionism is the liberation of the Jewish people. It's a liberal movement, and it was created by liberals. Again, fierce critic of Israel, okay, that's, even if I disagree, that's fine. But if your theory of liberalism is based on a denial of the Jewish people's right to collective self-determination, it can't be liberal.
Could it be that the one reason that young people are turning away is because the Jewish education they received, whether it was in school, summer camps, synagogues, it was very Zionistic, but perhaps it didn't provide a nuanced enough picture of Israel? I mean, Israel, like any other country, I say this as an Israeli, is far from perfect and faces significant challenges, to say the least. Do you think that maybe if what we have offered them to those Jewish teenagers was a more balanced and even critical discussion about Israel, it might have better equipped them to handle the anti-Zionist propaganda they encounter once they come to campus?
It might. You know, I'm an educator. Rabbis are teachers. But I'm not a master educator. I don't know. And we have members of our Jewish community who are master educators and spend a lot of time with young people. And I've heard that that's part of the discussion, what you just mentioned about being more nuanced and allowing people to encounter the full complexity of Israeli society and its relationship with the Palestinians and other Arab states. And that's a good thing. One, we have a challenge because we don't see the kids enough, but that said, I do think that's important, and to the extent that kids have an Israel experience, either as teenagers or as 20-somethings, Israel speaks for itself, and they should. I've taken thousands of people to Israel. I never hide anything. Israel speaks for itself. Let them see Israel as much as you can present in the full spectrum of opinions and approaches and so on. So, absolutely yes. I should emphasize, though, in my view, it's the anchoring principle that is most important. Ahavat Israel.
Your take on Tikkun Olam is fascinating for me because as an Israeli who first encountered the concept at Camp Tel Yehuda when I was 16, I was an Israeli shlicha to the camp. I was captivated by it. And I always felt since then that Israeli Judaism should embrace it much more. And looking at both communities right now, it seems that Israelis might be emphasizing Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Laze to an extreme, while American liberal Jews, as you argue, may have focused too heavily on Tikkun Olam. And I'm thinking, could it be that we're looking at a mirror image of two communities, each facing opposite yet equally significant challenges?
It's a great point and highlights how each community can benefit the other and why this dialogue and this mutual reinforcement is important to us because, and it's natural, you would expect Israelis who live in a Jewish state and are under constant pressure from the outside, especially in the last year and a half, right, which is conditions of war. You would expect Israelis to have more of an emphasis and a focus inwards on Israeli society. You've got people who are in the reserves for 100 days, 150 days. I met people last week in Israel who told me they were serving 250 days since October 7th. So, there's not much room in your head or in your heart if you're serving 250 days fighting the war to think about universal aspirations.
Naturally.
Right? So, and you would expect American Jews to be more open, Western Jews in general, Jews who live outside of Israel. And it's a good example of how we reinforce the other in complementing each community to live out the best of Jewish values. And Judaism is this blend of Tikkun Olam and Tikkun Ha'am, right? I was at Kibbutz Manara 2 weeks ago with 25 American rabbis. We invest in early career Reform rabbis in an intensive year-long fellowship. It's a prestigious program. We spent a week in Israel, and we were the first group that was allowed into Kibbutz Manara. Wow. Have you been to Manara?
Not after, before.
You have been to me, so you've been on the kibbutz. So it's 100 yards away from Lebanon. It's right on the border, right? And a local kibbutznik met us there, and we spent a couple of hours on the kibbutz seeing all the destroyed homes and looking out at the landscape. And at the end, when she bid us goodbye, she said the following that really struck me. It was very profound. I assumed this was a secular Israeli kibbutznik because that's what they all are at Kibbutz Manara, I think. But it really struck me. She said, don't forget us. Join hands with us. Help us rebuild. This is how you do Tikkun Olam. And that element of this is how you do Tikkun Olam, you help repair the lives of fellow Jews. That's also Tikkun Olam. Not only the lives of other people around the world, was so profound to me. And that's the element that was that has been missing in our conveying of Jewish identity to younger generations.
I want us to move on to the campuses. What did you think and what did you feel when you heard the chants on campuses? Globalize the Intifada, from the river to the sea, etc.
Well, we've been hearing that for years, but it had a special resonance post-October 7th. because we caught a glimpse in the Jewish world of what from the river to the sea really means to them if they ever had the power to implement their philosophy. It's a genocidal philosophy. And so it was particularly hurtful and resonant, and as I said before, it imposed on the American Jewish community, especially those of us in leadership, to respond, and to respond as aggressively as we could, which means, of course, to educate our young people who are on the front lines of this, but it also means responding politically and communally and financially. And the results, if you look at the state of the university campuses with respect to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism this year as opposed to last year, there's a noticeable difference and a noticeable improvement, and that's come about in large part, not entirely for sure, but in large part because of the response of American Jews who responded politically, responded through withholding contributions and donations, which is something I urge them to do, and others, of course. And I think they felt the inner compunction themselves, because how could they continue to contribute to their alma mater, to their universities, when they were so hostile to Israel and to Jews? And then there were all kinds of other factors as well. The politicians played a role. But if you just compare this year to last year, you can conclude that last year was an abysmal failure. Now, why was it a failure? From the perspective of the universities. 1, it was a failure of localized leadership. 2, might there have been some sympathy on the part of presidents and faculty members and administrators and DEI functionaries? 2, 20 years now of agitation on the part of opponents of Israel with respect to BDS and from the river to the sea and globalize the Intifada? I think so. And 3rd, it was a failure to understand how serious this issue is for the universities themselves. And so it wasn't as if they didn't have the guidelines on the books. Almost all the universities had rules that you can't build encampments on the quad. Okay, so the question is not, didn't they have the rules? The question was, why didn't they enforce their own rules? Now they are enforcing them better. And it just goes to show you, they could have done that a year ago.
Have you lost friends or colleagues who distanced themselves from you since October 7th?
Look, I work in the Jewish community. I see Jews all the time, and there have been some Jews who have had issues with me too, which is a good thing. It's part of what we do as Jews. The key area where I felt it is I've been part of interfaith dialogues for 20 years now in this city. And we have a lot of interactions with Christian and Muslim clergy. I even arranged one year take Christian and Muslim clergy, imams, with me to Israel. We spent a week together. And we were very friendly on a personal basis, but also we were allies. All of us come from liberal establishments, and we were allies in the cause. And it was astonishing to me that almost all of them, these people we had known for all these years, that we worked together, part of formal institutions that we established together, that almost none of them could condemn what happened on October 7th, even before Israel began to respond. That stunned me.
None of them,
almost
called you and said, we're so sorry?
Very few, 1 or 2.
Wow.
But even more, it's one thing not to call, although that would have been nice too. It was, from a public perspective, they couldn't bring themselves to condemn Hamas. They couldn't name Hamas. They couldn't condemn the atrocities. And when they did relate to it, they put it in so-called context of the struggle for liberation. To this day, I feel that hurt in me. I talk about it a lot.
Of betrayal.
It's a betrayal. You know what? It's not only a betrayal of us, it's a betrayal of their own values. That's the problem with making concessions to distorted values. So you had spoken a lot with attorneys who have represented Israeli women who were sexually assaulted. The hurt, the pain of the betrayal of international feminist organizations of their own values.
As a feminist, that was one of the most hurting moments, understanding that, me too unless you're a Jew.
Yeah. So that's what happens when you tolerate anti-Semitism and you entertain exceptions for violation of basic humanitarian and religious values. It corrupts you from the inside. It's not only about Jews. So institutions that were devoted to free speech and free learning, because they gave leeway to these kinds of destructive and hateful philosophies, it undermined their own values of free speech, free and liberal education. Feminist groups, international legal organizations, say what you want about Israeli politicians. I've spent a lot of time with politicians, and I'm well aware of their flaws, and I'm well aware that some people like the current government, some people don't like the current. It's not genocidal, okay? And so to take the leader of Israeli society, the prime minister of Israel, and to take him up on charges of war crimes and genocide undermines the foundations of respect for the law, respect for international law. And that's what happens with anti-Semitism. And so if you take a look at the last 2 years, over and over and over again, these great liberal institutions have been weakened because they can't see the values clearly, and it distorts their own values and undermines confidence in them. And I'm convinced that was one factor in the defeat of the Democrats in the recent elections.
That is exactly what I want us to move on to. It's yet another viral sermon you gave in a pre-election sermon at your synagogue half a year before elections. You issued a strong message to then President Biden, warning him not to take the American Jewish community for granted.
Do not take American Jews for granted. I have spoken with so many American Jews in the past few months who have surprised me with their anxiety about developments in the Democratic Party and their perception that it is becoming increasingly hostile to Israel and increasingly tolerant of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in its own ranks. Be careful. The results of the upcoming election do not only depend on Michigan.
That was quite an unusual move, especially considering that American synagogues, including yourself, of course, tend to avoid partisan politics. So what prompted you to take such a bold stance?
First of all, it was not partisan. I do not engage in partisan politics. I explain this over and over again. It doesn't mean that we're not engaged in the political process, because politics is the way we determine policies in the West. And policies are the business of religion. What religion is worth its weight in salt if they say, feed the hungry, but are unconcerned about the policies that lead to hunger and poverty? Right? It's a contradiction almost. You have to be involved in the policies that lead to suffering and misfortune. And the way we determine those policies and social approaches to these issues is through politics. So we have to be engaged in the political process, but I fiercely avoid partisanship. I don't tell people how I vote. It's irrelevant to me how they vote. I don't endorse candidates. I don't endorse political parties. It's not what I do, but I do speak a lot about the morality of the public policies. What I was concerned about, in particular, jolted me to give that speech this was in the middle of the campaign, the presidential campaign, and it centered around the primaries in Michigan. In Michigan, there's a big Middle Eastern population and a big Palestinian population, and they put effective pressure, and from their perspective, legitimate pressure, on the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, who ended up not only expressing certain words, which to me is part of a presidential campaign. You say what you need to say to win votes, and okay. But around that time, Biden imposed an arms embargo on Israel. It was those 2,000-pound bombs and so on. And that, to me, I concluded that that was primarily a result of the political process in the United States. And that was a red line for me. In other words, all the rhetoric is fine. Once you get to arms embargo, that required a response on our part. So it wasn't a partisan response. Mm-hmm. But it was mindful that for at least 80 years, American Jews have overwhelmingly voted for and supported financially liberal politicians, liberal American politicians. And I don't think it's ever good for any constituency, including the American Jewish community, to be taken for granted by any political party.
Have you been disappointed by how cautious Democratic leaders have been in addressing anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic elements within the progressive left?
Of course. Yeah. By the way, I should just point out there's plenty of anti-Semitism on the right, too.
Of course, and in the Trump camp, of course. Yeah. But I think that expectations are different among liberal Jews.
Because most of us are liberal. Mm-hmm. And Israel had a bipartisan consensus for much of its history. I think there's still a broad consensus, but it seems to be weakening or cracking. But I do think it's important to put on the record that we have an obligation to respond vociferously to anti-Semitism wherever it comes from, whether from the right and from the left. And there's plenty of anti-Semitism on the right. It tends to be not only focused on Israel, but on Jews. Attributes, that from their perspective threaten the American nation and so on and so forth. On the left, it tends to be focused on Israel. That's a harder distinction to make for many American Jews and for many liberals because, as we spoke before, where you draw the line between even erroneous but legitimate criticism and illegitimate anti-Semitic impulses is more difficult. It's more nuanced and it's more difficult. Jews kind of know it in their kishkas.
Yeah, you sense it.
Because we've seen it for centuries. But even then, as we spoke, not all Jews see it or agree with it.
In the end, the overwhelming majority of American Jews voted for Harris. However, the margins slightly shrank, according to polls. What do you understand from this data?
I think it's still early. I think it needs to be analyzed more, and I think it will be analyzed more. From the preliminary data, the numbers I saw were that something like 66% of American Jews voted for Kamala Harris, which is slightly down from the historic highs. It's noticeably down from the Biden support of the American Jewish community, which was in the 70s. So I think we can conclude first, American Jews still broadly consider themselves liberal and broadly support liberal parties and candidates. Two, the numbers were noticeably down, not necessarily irreversibly, dramatically down, but noticeably down. And they have gone up and down depending on candidates now for decades. What I think is important for both parties is, one, don't take the Jewish community for granted. I think that's very important for them and very important for the Jewish community. And two, if I were sitting in the Democratic establishment trying to analyze this, what is the importance of the Jewish vote? Number one, it is important in terms, Jews are less than 2% of the American population, but Jews vote disproportionately more. So disproportionately, we have more of an influence. And in some states, the Jewish vote does, to a certain degree, make a difference. But it's not only that, it's Jewish financial support, which is disproportionately generous. And it's also the kind of moral standing that Judaism has in the United States, uniquely in the United States, that gives additional importance to the American Jewish community and the Jewish vote. So I think if I were sitting in the Democratic establishment, one, I would conclude that the American Jewish vote is important to us. Two, that it is historically supportive of us. And I would worry given the results of these elections. And remember, Trump was an unconventional candidate. If it was somebody like Nikki Haley, what would the percentages have been?
If there was someone that would be much more acceptable for American Jews.
So if I were them, I would worry that whether this decline signified something longer term and deeper. Was it a one-off thing? Or was it a much deeper phenomenon? And once you lose a constituency, it's very hard to get it back. So if, in fact, you lose much of the Jewish vote, it could be a phenomenon that would last for many, many years. So I think the issue is serious with them.
You know, for over half a century, American Jewish identity felt like an inherent part of American life. I mean, Jews and Jewishness were a natural, unquestioned piece of the American dream. Has the surge in anti-Semitism shaken this fundamental assumption for you in any way?
That's a really great question. Among the conceptions that collapsed post-October 7th is, one, Israel is secure. Okay, that was so taken for granted by American Jewry and by Israel.
And by us,
too,
yeah.
Of course. That, in Israel is like, okay, we don't really have to pay too much attention to what's going on a mile away across the border because we have all this technology. We're part of the West. We can sit back and we'll know everything that happens. And it's the same kind of arrogance, that appears from lost personal memory. So this is similar to what happened on the Yom Kippur War. It's like this kind of arrogance. So you had generations that lived through that and didn't make that mistake again, and now you have new people making the same kind of mistakes because they didn't live through the experience. They only received it from learning. So, that's the same phenomenon here within American Jewry. That's one conception that collapsed, that Israel is secure. So secure that we don't have to pay too much attention to all these BDS anti-Zionists. The second conception that collapsed was faith in American liberalism to protect the Jews. We see this dramatic upsurge in anti-Semitism, which stunned and still stuns American Jewry. Something that we kind of expect if you're a European Jew, but not an American. In fact, it's fair to say that most American Jews have never lived through this kind of period that expresses this kind of animosity towards the Jewish community, individual Jews, Jewish institutions, and the Jewish state, Israel. There have been periods of substantial anti-Semitism in America, but not the kind that we're seeing since the end of World War II. And that then leads to third conception that collapsed, which is what we spoke about before, faith in American liberalism in general. There's a reason why most American Jews consider themselves liberals. It's because, one, they consider that to be most consistent with their understanding of Jewish values, which is my understanding too. And two, they believe that it is in the best interests of American society, but also the Jewish community.
They thrive.
To have a liberal order.
Thanks to liberal order.
Right. And with the rise of the hard left and identity politics and, what's called wokeism, and all of which were intensified in a very significant way post-October 7th, it's cast some shadow over the American Jewish community's faith in the liberal establishment and the liberal order.
In a conversation over the phone a few weeks ago, you mentioned that you hope that 2025 will be a year of healing for the Israeli society, since American Jews can't truly heal until Israel begins its own healing process. Can you expand on that?
I think all of us are still in the trauma phase. I kind of sense it in myself as well. To be able to grapple with post-trauma, you have to have freed yourself of the trauma. And I don't believe we've done that yet. We're so linked together that if Israel hasn't freed itself of the immediate trauma, then no other world Jewish community can free itself of the trauma because we're bound to each other. I hope we're approaching a phase now, and that 2025 will mark the end of the active fighting, the resolution of the hostages, one way or the other, that the ones that are still alive will be restored and the ones that are dead will be returned for proper burial.
Amen.
Until that happens, until the fighting ends, and until responsibility is investigated and assigned and accepted, military responsibility for the catastrophes of October 7th, and political responsibility, which means the establishment of a National Commission of Investigation, which will come with conclusions, and those conclusions will then be accepted by people who have been assigned responsibility. In other words, they should resign. Until that process begins in earnest, I don't think Israel can begin to get into the next phase of grappling with the recovery, emotional recovery, economic recovery, political recovery, and so on. And until that happens, nobody else can either.
We've nearly reached the end of our conversation, but before we depart, here's our Jewish Crossroads questionnaire. 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready, Rabbi Hirsch?
Go ahead. I'm not sure I can answer them.
I'm sure you will. What's your earliest Jewish memory?
I would say among my earliest memories are building a sukkah in our home in Bethesda, Maryland.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
I'd like to see them all. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall on Mount Sinai. The great King David, King Solomon, the great rabbis, would have loved to have observed firsthand the rise of the kingdom and the destruction of the kingdom, too. I would have wanted to intervene and said, are you crazy to rebel against the Romans? So
that's a rabbi's approach, not only to meet them, but to try to change history.
That's right, yeah.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
Like everybody, Pesach. I also a rabbi, so I like that the community shows up in full force on the high holy days on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
If you could jump 100 years into the future in one sentence, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
Israel at peace and the American Jewish community alive, vigorous, and prosperous.
What's one Jewish word? It could be Hebrew, English, Yiddish, whatever, that feels particularly meaningful to you right now.
Tikva.
Amen for that. Rabbi Hirsch, this conversation has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for an insightful, fascinating talk. Toda rabba.
Thank you very much, and good luck on the podcast.
Well, that's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. What questions would you like us to explore? Are there specific topics you'd like us to dive deeper into? Feel free to share your thoughts and feedback with us. Thank you very much to Tomer Atzabi-Bar, who edited this chapter. And we'll meet again, right? Same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon. Leitraot.